I'm going to ask you about wanting to be a documentary filmmaker, because you told me.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing. I think that the cartoons really came out of researching for making a documentary film about education. So I wanted to really research and look at early forms of childhood issues of race, racism, things like that. And so the cartoon became the earliest I could think of where identity was, on display for a young child. And that's how I started to research things like Disney cartoons, Fleischers, Tex Avery, things like that. So Dumbo came out of researching for all of that. I was looking at films that were kind of the cartoons during double features in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, there's a whole program, you guys, for those people under 100. There would be a feature, and then a documentary short subject, and then a cartoon, and then trailers, and then another feature. And then it would be, the weekend you could go home from the movie theater.
Right. And often they would be, either politically, based, or usually they would be talking about the current time, and it was wartime, so a lot of them were, early Mickey Mouse cartoons and early, Steamboat Mickey, things like that, were kind of all those were part of those cartoons that were between double features. So that's really where that came from. The film never came about because it was I was working on it with somebody else, and you know how those kind of collaborations go from time to time. And we never made the film never came to fruition, but it sort of springboarded me into this issue of erasure and disappearance and ghosting and tracing and how that kind of is the underlying defining thing about blackness.
God, again, before we got started, you guys can finally hear me saying this now. I was saying I think the thing that links Southern black culture to West Indian culture is this idea of using every part of the pig but the oink, which is to say everything is a resource to either lead your life with or make art with. The coffee grounds you use to sort of stain wood with or to paint with.
Sure.
And that idea that everything is a resource and nothing should be judged as anything else because you can use it and turn it into something, which also is basically kind of what black culture is about too.
Sure. I think we were talking about, even cooking and food, and how soul food or West Indian food comes out of, that the scraps and things that were left over or things that went bad and turned and, were turned into sauce, and that nothing was really ever written down, that it was a kind of, it was almost like an oral history is how you understood history. So I remember cooking is a big thing for me, and in my house. So I would cook with my grandmother, and I'd say, well, how many cups of that or how many teaspoons of that are you putting in? She's there is no, I don't know. You just put it in until you know when it's right. And you just kind of followed along, and you got a feeling, a sense. I think you do the same thing today with music. You get a sense of how the room is moving before you put the next disc on. And I think that kind of response, that kind of almost call and response kind of way of is the driver to the culture.
But that idea of conversation as being part of black culture and black artistic motivation, and I was saying to you that I've always thought of hands in your work, and we were talking about cooking before because this thing that also becomes a part of the black experience through handicraft and art is you're in the garden and you're using your hands, and you know how much fertilizer and eggshell, whatever you're going to use to make that thing happen. Forget fertilizer, eggshell and coffee grounds or whatever. Or when you're woodworking, you know exactly what the wood is supposed to feel like, and you're not really measuring it. And when you're cooking, you grab a handful of this and a pinch of that, and you know how the reaction is when you throw it into the pot. You can see how it cooks on top. All this stuff is about using your hands and what that feels like, and also what you're going through at the time, whatever emotional experience you're going through, is transmitted through your hands as well, isn't it?
Sure, absolutely, and I think that's important to me, that my hands are on the work. I think that's where all the power comes out of. That's where the sadness comes out of. That's where the violence comes out of. The frustration comes out of. All of those things. The hand is almost connected, like a tissue, to your emotion. So I could do or draw the same image 100 times, and there'll be 100 different drawings because of how I felt that day, because of how I was, responding to the paper, or the music that I'm listening to, or just the mood that I woke up in. And I think that your hands are that. I don't like to use as brushes as much. I do use them, but I think I use my hands more because I like to get into the work, to feel it through my fingers, which is exactly what you're talking about. It's like working in the garden or cooking in the kitchen. When you're chopping onions, you get a sense of how fine you want that herb chopped. So it's funny how much we're talking about food, but I think they're very well connected. Yeah, that's what I would say about
No, because
hands and touch.
one of the things I sort of chart too is I can sort of see your emotional development in the work. The early work has a lot more pounding
Yeah.
and sweeps. There's a lot more power. I don't want to say not nuanced, but I can see you working things out,
Yeah.
and marrying technique to your emotional state.
Sure. I think doing this show was kind of intense because I think I was working off of a lot of energy at certain points. I think the wall drawings specifically, I had a great team that I worked with. We'd get to a point and I would be doing the erasure, and then literally same day I spun around on my heels and looked at the other wall and was like, fuck this, we're doing the other wall. Because I just had that kind of energy. That's something I've never done before. I've never had a moment where I could actually attack two walls same day. It's just unheard of. The physicality of it, the emotion of it, all of that. Usually I'll do a drawing and then take a few days in between to recover, and then come back and attack it again. And in this case, it was literally, the two opposite walls were done same day.
Well, but as you're saying that, I could kind of feel you sort of channeling the energy of the past couple of years, especially what happened in Minneapolis, and moving back and forth, and because the four states of emotion on those walls kind of figure into all that for me. I can sort of feel where we are as a people, where this country is, all of that. I can feel your ambition, but also your need to get this stuff up on those walls.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that's interesting about the show is that I think it really speaks to the moment in time that we're in, whether it's issues of race that we're dealing with on a daily basis, or Roe v. Wade, or what have you. I think that there's a sense of frustration, anger, rage. All of those things are out there to draw on, and I think that when you're installing and you have something that's so physical, so dependent on you moving through space and drawing an image that is inherently racist, and you're violently trying to get rid of that. I almost like live off of that. That fuels the speed of the drawing, the nuance to the drawing, the way it's, and then at other times there's parts and pieces that you kind of slow down and take, you're taking it sort of slower, and it's almost like a caress of the wall as opposed to a violent, drag of certain images. So there are pockets and moments and times where there is rest periods, if you will, also for the eyes, I think.
But I guess I'm just thinking about that too. You saying caress, and I just felt that they're, in some ways, those walls feel almost like the passage of seasons to me. This movement from this to this to this, to finally the sort of like the respite of maybe summer, looking up at the stars, and that hope that maybe there's a little bit of hope in there, but also there's something wistfulness too about time that's passed that we won't get back.
Yeah, I think that, those specific drawings were carefully selected to put together. I knew when I walked in that room, I've been staring at that room and chomping at the bit for a long time to get in there. It's we build. I'm still old school, so I build physical models. So we call it the dollhouse in the studio. So I have the dollhouse built and just walk past it and stare at it every single day. And so I'm already intimately invested in the space. And then I'll do a digital drawing. So then there's that. And then since I do now live in LA, I can actually come to the space and walk through it. So I came and walked through the space multiple times. And then there's the moment where you try to have the room talk to you, right? So I knew that I wanted to start with a couple dancing, because the way architecturally that we split the room, it felt like this perfect square that two lovers or something would dance, like perform a dance together. So I started with the dancers, and then, I really wanted to pull in a kind of musical aspect to it, a musician, if you will. So I knew opposite that I wanted a piano player. So I went to Fats Waller, and the one that's opposite the two dancers is Fats Waller being dragged across the walls. So at that point, it then became almost, there's this moment where you start to think about romance and dreaming, hope, as you said, loss even, certain types of violence. That the stars represent a lot of things in cartoons. I mean, when one cartoon figure hits another, the first thing they see is a ring of stars around their head. So there's all of these issues that are inherent in the imagery. And so I wanted the viewer to enter that space and make those conclusions themselves. And then as they spin and come to leave the room, you're faced with the frog getting lynched on the backside. So it's as if to remind you that this is where this horror comes from. So there's a way of almost intentionally visually constructing a room where you're kind of drawing somebody in with one image and then coming back out with another.
I guess what I was thinking when I saw it, and those are my thoughts pouring through the microphone, so forgive me, it's kind of a violent thing happening here. It's just that they represent all these poles of the black experience, that you can have beauty and music and the possibility of romance and the threat of violence, all these ideas that coexist, and sort of how black experience in some ways has the same kind of overripe surrealist absurdity as a cartoon.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you can think too is probably black comedians, right? If you think of somebody like a Richard Pryor, a Chris Rock, somebody like that, and sometimes these guys will, drop a joke and the audience will be like, ooh, that's a little close to the quick. Like, how could you laugh at that? How could that be funny to you? And I think that there's a way of taking a horrific situation and flipping it around, because you have to deal with these situations on a daily basis. So you're trying to find the moments, the pauses in these places to actually find the humor, find the love, find the feel, that you can survive that moment. And so, I think somebody like Richard Pryor, when you watch him on stage, that a lot of those jokes are inherently sad. Like you think, when he's being self-deprecating and he's talking about his own drug use and, post when he got burned up, and he's making jokes about himself running down the street on fire, and people are sort of like, ow, how can you...
Or jokes about the heart attack. And
or jokes about the heart attack from doing too much cocaine. And I think that it's like, how can he make those jokes? And it's like, well, you have to find those moments to sort of turn the lens back on yourself to survive those horrific moments. And, I look at Pryor and I look at some of those comedians, and if you know any comedians, it's that tragic clown thing where there is that underpinning of sadness. I have a couple friends that are comedians, and they're not funny all the time. Like, they have moments. In fact, they're actually quite dark. Yes. You know, and they're just really good at finding those things that we all find really horrific and making us deal with them through laughter and humor. And I think that we do that as visual artists as well, where you're trying to search for an image that will carry you through some of those horrific periods.
I guess I was thinking too, so often about the way you use erasure, is that thing we were just talking about before we sat down here, is the idea that Black history is constantly being erased. And the thing that does keep it alive is hands and the oral tradition and talking about it. But it's in this process, it's a really transient thing, and that Black art is still being defined and still looked upon as being a phenomenon rather as part of the currency of popular culture. I mean, all these things are in that for me.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, that work, all of that work, whether it's the sculptural piece, the wall drawings, the paintings, even the arc itself, I think hinges on the space between representation and abstraction, and calling on the viewer or the audience to kind of fill in those gaps through their own experience. And you need to leave avenues of access in any kind of work for your viewer to enter the work on their own terms, so that you're not doing the shake the finger thing at somebody. Nobody wants to hear me sit and scream into a microphone and tell you this is wrong and that is wrong. You're more likely to get something valuable out of a conversation and exchange between the two. So I think that is really important, to allow for forms of access. You know, it's the same thing if you look at something like hip-hop music, right? And hip-hop music is inherently a Black music form. But if you look at the real history of hip-hop music, there were a lot of white kids in New York at the time that were break dancers and graffiti artists and DJs and everything else. Dante's here. He can tell you. Where are you? There you are, man. You know, it was a diverse group of folks, and I think that there's access points for a lot of different experiences through the culture of that. It's not just a one myopic way of thinking, and that's the way the art works as well. You know, the only way that you can access it is if you find those places.
I guess I find myself thinking too in a lot of the work, especially some of the early work, but these pieces too, is about how nostalgia is kind of almost a non-existent thing for Black culture. That because of it's almost dangerous to look back at the moment, because what are you looking back at? I mean, for the most part,
yeah, it's
sadness mixed in with pleasure,
right.
Pain mixed in with a good time.
Unless you talk to my father, who's like, you know, back in my day. And now I'm that guy. So I sit and talk to my daughter and go, you know, back in the day.
Are you really that guy?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, I'm listening to Lil whoever, and I'm like, well, you know, y'all don't know the first thing about hip-hop, man. This is like, put some Rakim on the record. Like, I don't want to hear that shit.
Yes.
Lil somebody. You know, they're all Lil. Why are they all Lil? I don't understand that. They're all little.
I don't know.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, little Nas X, little Yachty, a lot of Lils.
See, that's what I'm talking
so
about.
Like it sort of becomes Lil Abner after a while. But I find myself thinking, though, to that idea, again, that you're saying that there's a danger, though, in the Black experience to be nostalgic about things, because there's a certain part of your work that's always about, and I think that for me, the erasure is about the blur of emotion, of trying to move forward even if you can't.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, you know, nostalgia, all jokes aside, I think that nostalgia is a dangerous place to you know, you want to kind of almost brush up against the line of nostalgia without crossing. That's the danger zone. Because then you're sort of, nostalgia falls into almost pining for a period of the past and romanticizing that period and forgetting about, you know, all the prickly parts. And so you wanna. It's a line somewhere between nostalgia and memory. So I mean, there are no true, real, actual memories of an event, right? We all sort of obscure them one way or the other. If you think about the first love that you were involved in, you're probably going to think about all the highlights and the best parts of it, and the worst relationships, you're going to think about the low points. But of course, at some point, you were in love with that person. They weren't just all horrible. So I think that nostalgia is a very kind of dangerous place, but it's fun to play up against. It's fun to rub up against as far as creating imagery like that.
Especially with these images that are that iconic and were so iconic and huge during their heyday. The idea of the way that plays with the dangers of nostalgia for me.
Yeah.
Because you're romanticizing a past that dehumanized us.
Sure, absolutely. And I think you want to, but at the same time, you also don't want to like turn it into, this almost like surgery, like, kind of clinically taking it apart.
Right.
There are places where you sort of digest the material, and I think that if we clinically, cut it up in certain ways, you're leaving out those parts where play happens. So that's what I mean when I say that it's a very delicate kind of place between,
No, but whenever the idea of taking characters that have a representation, very different representation for black people,
right,
and it doesn't matter where you're from in the diaspora versus the mainstream, then the idea of, there's always something playful about that, because for certain people they suggest innocence or humor. There's one dimension in that for them, and there are multiple dimensions in them for us, and so there's always something, I think playful about, or often I should say something playful about the work.
Yeah, I think it needs to stay playful at certain times. I mean, we the way that you recall certain things, there is playfulness. There's allowance for playfulness in those places. And when you look at something like the sculptural piece here in the last room, there's a lot of places like the spirograph, things like that. Those things bring to memory. If you've ever played with a spirograph, there's that moment where the little gear thing pops out of the original one and messes up your entire drawing. It's like a nightmare. And I'm not going to lie, we did that. We had a few mistakes in the studio, like, redoing some of those. And that's part of the fun of it. Ooh, look, I got a perfect one. There's playfulness. And I think that, when you were, doing little kind of scribbles and graffiti and things on school tables, there's a playful, I always loved that in school, where there was this banter, this back and forth, where
the conversation we were talking about, yeah.
Yeah, and then you would finish it. It was almost like an Exquisite Corpse or something, where I would draw something in third period, and by fourth period you added to it, and then somebody else added to that, and so on and so on. And this drawing just grew in time, and you had no idea that suddenly there were, a tree growing out of somebody's back of his head, and suddenly there's eggs on the end of it. Like there was just all of these crazy additive drawings that happen, and there's playfulness in there. Somebody would always like screw it up by making some snide comment or something, and then you'd have to respond to that. And and I think that the same thing with bathroom graffiti. So bathroom graffiti is some of the most brilliant shit ever sometimes. Like you go into bathrooms and you're just like, wow, these people, like if you could put this energy into something positive, we'd be in a far better place.
No, unfortunately, that energy all goes into Twitter nowadays.
Yeah, it's called Twitter.
Again, this takes me back to why I feel like hands are so often a part of the work, because those tables, you can feel the tactile element, the concrete, that also that idea of the dangers of nostalgia. I mean, because when you're making those drawings, they mean everything in the world to you. If you're trying to like carve this thing out, make sure you get that one last circle for the spirograph. Just one. Come on, we got the blue and the green. Just make the red go. Oh man!
Yeah.
So that
I'm not gonna lie. I mean, me and my production manager would go through that every day when we would you'd almost fall into it of trying to make the perfect drawing, and I would tell her, don't make it perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. Like, leave the mistakes in. But you're trying to recall a moment that you went through,
Sure.
And replicate it, and it's a strange experience to try to replicate something. So how we did that was, on a daily basis, we would walk past, we'd set up all these tables, and an idea would hit you, and you just kind of scrawl on it while you were on your way to do something else. And it sort of kept us honest. So it wasn't like you were sitting down and, making the drawing that looks like the thing in high school. It was just a kind of casual additive thing at certain times. There were times where we would sit down and kind of do that. But for the most part, it was a kind of additive thing as you're walking by.
Because, again, this idea of, we're talking about tradition, things being passed along, that becomes part of it too. But this thing is kind of like a part of the oral tradition, and also the idea of not ever throwing anything away. I mean, those tables would be around forever. They never got resurfaced. They might get painted, but
Right.
somebody scratch the paint off so you could
Paint
see
over them.
Yeah, what lived underneath. You like during the Jurassic era of high school to see what somebody left before you.
For sure.
And we are sitting on a place that to me feels like it's part of that tradition, the idea of never throwing anything away. I mean, at some point in some inner city neighborhood, you've seen somebody with these kinds of speakers out on their front yard for a family reunion, just drag them out every Sunday night, or just never putting them away.
Yeah.
So they get weather beaten.
Yeah.
And I feel that energy here sitting on this space right now.
I mean, I think that's where the arc actually came out of, was recalling. I spent most of my childhood summers, when I was a kid, we'd go to the West Indies in the summertime because that's when the tourists didn't go and it was cheaper. So we'd go to Barbados, we'd go to Jamaica, we'd go to Antigua sometimes.
Money. Nice.
Well, we went in the summer, so it was, it's like rainy season in the West Indies. Don't get it like, he's flossing. It was, that was the cheapest time of year to go. It was hot as hell down there at that time. And I would go see most of my relatives. So I wasn't lounging on the beach with drinks with umbrellas. I was like going to Auntie's house, up in the mountains, hot as hell. But I love that. Like that for me was my experience in the summer. I look forward to it all the time. And one of the things was the dance hall is so important to West Indian culture that, it's made from scraps and shards and one-offs from different places, gathered materials, whatever you had, if it was corrugated roofing, if it was bits and pieces of plywood, if it was chain link fence, whatever it was. People like Lee Perry made that dub sound out of that kind of remnants, if you will. And, when I went to New Orleans, it was post-Katrina. It was a long time after Katrina. And there was still bits and pieces of the hurricane left over. So I immediately put the two together in a certain way of to go back to our earlier conversation of taking something that's so horrific and turning it into something positive. So for me, those tissues between the West Indies and New Orleans were so strong that it just told me to make this the sound system. And I think for me it was all about creating this object, this sculpture, this living sculpture that provided a space for other artists to work on and do. So the idea is for them to, and it's a challenging thing as an artist. I mean, I think that visual artists are probably the most selfish people you'll ever meet in your life. If you're in a relationship with an artist, then you know this. They are like the most selfish people ever, in a good way. And I think that, because they're obsessed, and I think that's what we're in love with. We're in love with folks that are so obsessed with their project, their production, their thing that they're working on, and that there's a draw, there's a sexiness to that. And that's what I mean when I say it's almost like an obsession. And to be around that it's work. It takes a lot of work. So we don't share very well. Generally, we don't play well in the sandbox together. It's like my little area, and like you can go find your own sandbox someplace. So I wanted to create a sandbox that allowed for other artists to do their things.
Ghetto, you'll give you some more space here. I can take the hint.
I already had my sandboxes in there.
But it's funny because this idea of individual pursuit and community are these things, again, for me there's so many, I don't want to say contradictory elements, but elements battling themselves there, you know, and these things, these speakers that are repurposed, again, you see them like almost in any black neighborhoods, and they usually come out in the summertime. You can almost smell,
absolutely.
When it's rainy, you can smell the wood warping.
Yeah. Or the barbecue that's being cooked off in the corner. I mean, it's some of the best memories of growing up in New York are those like hot, sticky summer, you know, at night. Somebody'd string some lights up or whatever, some speakers would get pulled down, you plug into the wherever, and then you had an electrical source, and somebody had turntables, not as nice as these, but somebody would have some ratty ass turntables and start playing some music, and a party would just pop off. And I think that there's that ingenuity, that like creating something from nothing, that moment where you're, you know, an event has just occurred. You know, the uptown parties that we used to go to that would just erupt. And there was this weird, now I guess you just text and let people know, but it was more of a word of mouth kind of a thing, like, hey, where are you going? I'm going on such and such train to go to this party, or the neighborhood, you could just hear the music in the background somewhere and just you're drawn to it. So there's something about that goes back to what you were saying about the hands-on, that like need to create something from nothing out of your hands, you know, and I think that the beauty of this piece is that kind of agency that's created for other people to do their thing. And I love the fact that I never program it, you know, it's always the institution that programs the ARC. So in this case, Russell Salmon was the programmer for the ARC, and he did an insane idea of putting this huge, diverse group of folks together, from Savion Glover to Dante Ross, to perform on the ARC, and then it gets historicized. You know, it gets put in an archive, so people can see those performances from now until whenever, and that I get a lot of joy out of seeing other people perform on something that you created. It's a really interesting test for yourself.
It's interesting too, because all these things we're talking about, the idea of, you know, the old days, the turntablists, you were working with your hands, you like reading the grooves, trying to feel what that space was between cuts, so you knew where to stop, because you wouldn't have much light, and like you were saying, you were repurposing. Somebody probably like strung extension cords up into a street light somewhere, and hoping that the cops weren't going to come down that street, but also having found somebody else's turntable and finding a new belt, maybe 3 rubber bands to keep the turntables going. But this idea of never throwing anything away, seeing value in something, and everything is a resource. I mean, that feels to me like this particular structure feels like it's that point for you where everything joins.
Yeah, that's well put. I mean, it's also that sense of passing. It goes back to the cooking thing. I keep going back to cooking. You know, like watching somebody spin records. There was no YouTube to learn how to do that. You stood over somebody's shoulder and watched them do that. You know, that's like a passed on oral tradition, you know, or somebody would be on the tables and then they'd get off and you'd say, hey, how did you do, you know, that cut, or how did you sample that beat, or whatever it is. And so it's a passed on tradition that again is hands on, and I think that there's something to that. You know, it's why guys build hot rods, you know, or whatever it is that they build computers. I don't care what it is, as long as your hands are on it. And you don't have, I never wanted to have that distance between me and whatever it is that I'm making. I need my hands in it, you know.
But it's also for me too that your work is so much about a life that's been lived before we get to these places. You know, be it through seeing the crow sculptures on those lunchroom tables, or here, just looking at the way the joins between the planks.
Right.
Just thinking about, well, where'd this come from, and where's that come from, and this definitely feels like there's more tensile strength in this piece of wood than that one, and what it took to sort of find and figure out which pieces to keep and which and how to cut them. All that idea of, for me, a lot of black art, and I really think of you when I think about this, is part of a de facto underground. I mean, it sort of takes place in plain sight, but until it's sort of seen by the mainstream and stolen, it's just this kind of secret that's passed along from one to another.
Wow, that's a nice compliment. You know, I like to think of it as almost, you know, it goes back to the DJing thing. For me, it's like visual DJing. It's research, right? And then you're taking an image and then recontextualizing it. It's all about like how this image is processed. And then you have to deal with like history. How do I bring something that's historically relevant back then into the present? Sometimes it's not that difficult. Other times there has to be a handle on it. You have to like kind of carry something over. So, you know, it's a very delicate balance between those things when you find an image and then recontextualize it. I think that's what's important. That's one of the problems I think that the internet poses, is that there's this ability to take something without understanding the context from which it came, and that's sort of just a random. You're almost reinventing the meaning of certain things, and I think that's a loss. I think that there's richness in understanding where an image comes from, or a sound, or whatever. There's a very rich place to know how something was, where it came from, a source.
But there's the other side of that too, which exists so much in sampling. The idea of taking something that you don't know where it comes from, but you just like the way it literally it feels in your hands.
Yeah.
And I'm going to put it here because I just like the way it feels. I like the way other people are going to encounter it. And you're actually creating a history for something, because it becomes this ahistorical artifact. It's just something you like the way it sounds, or you like the way this piece of wood looks and goes with that one, or you like the way these two speakers look like they make a cathedral. They're not quite the same size, but if I find a way to sort of cantilever this, it becomes its own structure.
Right.
I mean, it's as much about inventing a history, I think, as compared to reinventing history.
You know, I have a friend, a DJ in New York, this guy Rob Swift. He was in this group called the Executioners. And do you know Rob? He's unbelievable. And I went to Rob's house one day, and you know, I used to mess around with the turntables a little bit, but when you go to Rob's house, it's a whole other it's like there's Little League, and then there's like Yankee Stadium. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just insane. So this guy has 4 turntables. He's got about 20,000 records to draw from. So we were working on a sound piece together, and he starts spinning, and he just casually starts putting records on the tables, and they're spinning and everything, and he's looking through this. Now this dude is looking through 20,000 records while a beat is playing over here on this turntable, and I see him like flicking through like hundreds of albums. He pulls out this one album, he puts it down on the disc, he cues it up, and I'm sitting there and I'm listening to the beat, and I was like, what the fuck, what is that sound, man? And I look at the album that he has, and it's like this obscure record from Battlestar Galactica. He had this little tiny sample that he knew in his brain he wanted to hear at that very moment to complete this mix between 4, and I was like, whoa, okay, I play records, you DJ, man. Like that's a whole other thing, because he knew exactly what his catalog of sound, not even just records, of sound was so far ahead in his brain that he knew that little sample was what he needed in that moment, and it was incredible to watch, you know.
See, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about that room and those 4 walls, and you're doing kind of the same thing. It felt like that to me. And as you described, that's kind of the sort of the perfect kind of metaphor for no. Oh wait, it's got to be fast. It's got to be here. But wait, I need this line going down on the stars. Wait, no. The frog's got the eyes have got to be a little blurrier, but a little more focus in the center. I could, as you were talking about him, I was actually thinking about that crazy like $6 Million Man sample they did, which I don't know how they managed to do that and not be sued off the planet. But I was thinking about all that as you were talking about him, and that room feels like that kind of energy to me, and just knowing, well, okay. I see. I know it's in this wall. Looks like it's just a bunch of albums to you, or blank space to you. But I know what needs to be there. Yeah. You were just describing the way you worked in that room, weren't you?
Well, I'd like to think that's what I do visually. That's a huge compliment. I appreciate that. It's very thankful for that. It's one of those things that I think, anybody that plays records like that knows that. You're always 3, 4, 5 records ahead of your audience, and by the time you've placed that sound and identified it, the DJ is 3, 4, 5, 6 records away. Like, he's already gone, long time. You're hearing the Jackson 5, and by the time you're like, oh yeah, that's that Jackson 5 beat, he's already on to Ring My Bell. So it's that's, for me, that's where you're starting to play with memory in a very real way, because you're tapping into those places. Visually, you do it the same way. It's like, where did that image come from? Where does that, and you're trying to piece it together, and then at somewhere along the line, you realize that it's like this sort of amalgam of lots of different images. Somebody always asks me, do you take the image specifically from one cartoon and just do the drawing there? And I always say no. There's a lot of pieces that are either added in, left out, that you don't know that that's there. I'll recreate an image by splicing two together. I did a piece a long time ago called The Ghoster, and it looks like it's the Coney Island the cyclone, and but it's not. It's made up of about 4 or 5 different roller coasters, but it's calling on your memory in certain ways, in bits and pieces. It feels familiar. You feel like you can anchor it, but you can't, because it's made up of all these different images. And I think that's the difference between a memory, or trying to sort and trying to anchor a memory, as opposed to nostalgia, where you're pining back for this period from the past. I'm not interested in pining from the past. I'm reminding you of something from the past that we're still inherently having to deal with. And the anger and rage that it takes to want to erase that image is always there. And so that's a representation at that point.
I mean, let me ask you this. Because for me, art is, be it painting or music or theater, it's about the creator pulling us into whatever emotional state they're in at the moment.
True.
And I feel like at its heart, that's what links all of art. And I can feel that. Would you agree with that? Because I feel that so often not so often, I feel that constantly in your work.
Agree with
the idea that an artist has to pull us into whatever they're feeling at the time.
Yeah, I think that you can't help it. I think that it's you're responding to something, I think, and that's why I think certain works live the course of time. You look at something like Basquiat, okay, right? Basquiat, there's a lot of interest, if you were around during the time Basquiat was painting a lot of those paintings, it's a very interesting. First of all, it's not that long a period of time. People like to think of it as this, long period. It was probably 5 years.
There's just so much work.
There's a lot of work. He was very prolific, and there's also right before he passed, Basquiat couldn't get a show. People forget that. He was almost considered, in a 5-year period, he went from mega superstardom to being over
Like
in
finished
5
over.
years, like finished over and out. Like we don't want to look at that anymore in 5 short years.
And a sad junkie.
In a very sad, yeah. And now it's romanticized into this whole other thing. But I remember when Basquiat couldn't get a show anywhere on the back of the dumpster of the restaurant. It was just like you couldn't get. Now you look at the auction rooms and you're talking about 70, 40, $1 million for a painting.
The piece of stuff that he might have given somebody.
Exactly. Actually, there's a funny story. I'll tell you this funny story. I had a roommate who I won't say who that is, but he was friends with Jean-Michel, and they used to get into recreational activities together, shall we say? And I hated.
The statute of limitations is passed. You can say, but that's okay.
They were junkies. So I hated heroin and anybody that did it. So I said, listen, I don't want this shit in my house or anybody else that's doing it. So he used to get together with John in the house and do heroin while I was gone. So y'all are gonna crack up about this. So I didn't really know Jean-Michel. I just knew he hung out with my roommate. So Jean-Michel, anybody that knows him or heard of stories about him, used to draw constantly on anything that was around. So we lived on like 103rd and 5th, I think. It was right by the train. Anyway, Jean would do all these drawings all over things as he got high. And then they would start nodding out and fall asleep, and I'd come home, and I'd throw a big fit and be like, the person's name, get up and clean up this fucking house and get your junkie friend out of this house. So we'd start doing this thing, and John would leave, and so I'd start throwing stuff away. And there's all these
It's hilarious so far.
Yeah. So I'm sitting there and I'm throwing away, pizza boxes and chicken bags and all this kind of thing. And there's all these drawings on them, like fucking throwing this shit away. I must have thrown away about $20 million worth of drawings in my house. Had no idea what I was doing. I did that. So
I think I understand all the anger in your work now. Now I really,
so don't talk to
really
me
get
about
that.
nostalgia. So, yeah.
But that we're talking about him, and you guys have, in a lot of ways, similar backgrounds, and this sort of need to that idea of hands and that blurring thing,
Yep.
and the idea of sort of putting figures in space without any sort of context around them, often without a ground under them. This thing you do so constantly, these speakers kind of floating with a frame around them. I mean, I just sort of feel that kind of kinship to that idea of grabbing things out of the air and getting them down while they're still sort of coursing through your bloodstream.
Yeah. I mean, I think why I brought up that story and Jean was because I think that those paintings and those images have lived the time since. They weren't dated. They weren't anchored to a period. You don't look at those paintings and just go, oh yeah, they're from the 80s and leave it at that. There are painters that you can probably do that and go, wow, that was an amazing period, downtown New York, blah, blah, blah. But I think that those great marks that were made, it was important for him to get his hands deep into the work. If you look at that and how he worked and how he painted and all of that, yeah, I think that he was, as you said, somebody that had their hands deep into the work, and yeah, I think that there's an understanding there of the need for that. I would never put me in the same category with John, but it was. I think there's a common space that's occupied. I think with certain artists. I look to other. I look to Cy Twombly. I look to Gerhard Richter. I think there's. Richter's different. I think Richter creates certain tools that put distance between him and the canvas, and especially his drag paintings. I think that's inherently important to him. He has a whole philosophy about creating that space and not having his hands on it. But that attention to the hand, whether to deny it or to embrace it, I think is still there. And I do agree with you. I think it goes back to Black history in that way.
No, I mean, that you talking about Jean-Michel. One of the things I was thinking again, this idea, two things, pieces off or figures often floating, and that sort of question or negative space that gets asked, because it is often that's for me that sense of, is there a future or a past around these things? They're about sort of being in this moment and what you feel at this time, and some things, even though a lot of your work is about the transitory, those crows and those etchings and those paintings and those tables aren't. They're meant to sort of be forever.
Yeah, I think they're also meant to haunt you.
Yes.
Right. I mean, I think that those crows are there in that similar way that a Hitchcock film. What I was hoping for was The Birds. Yeah. That's one of the scariest movies to date. Earlier we were talking about your new film that you're working on, which is fascinating that you're starting in 1968, because I think that there's a lot going on with that, and I actually did do a show that dealt with Night of the Living Dead.
Did you?
Yeah, I did. So it was funny when we were having a conversation about the film Night of the Living Dead, and that character is so important. I mean, you can more eloquently speak to that, but I think that it's funny that we both had this interest completely separate from each other in that particular character in Night of the Living Dead. For those that haven't seen Night of the Living Dead, there's basically the concept. There's this zombies take over the world, and how would you put it in a nutshell?
It's the first zombie apocalypse movie, done for no money, with a black lead, because the white guy who was supposed to star in it sort of disappeared 2 weeks before shooting began, and so got this guy who taught at Rutgers, and can you do this? Yeah, I guess so. Okay, it was a zombie movie, I don't care. But the race of the character is never mentioned, but there are all these connections, I think unintentional, but if you look back at it now, it's like watching all the race riots of 1968, and for those who haven't seen it, I don't want to give away the ending, but it so fits into that period and what happened to people, and it's, again, about this idea of art being created just by introducing a black idea into it.
Yeah, I mean, my work begins and ends with film in a lot of ways. It starts with as a reference point, and a lot of times it references it throughout the work. So Night of the Living Dead and that particular character, also Planet of the Apes. I'm obsessed with Planet of the Apes.
And they're the same year.
And they're the same year. And it's all about a society that's flipped on its head. So
and very different metaphors for race.
Very different metaphors, yeah. But touching down on race through science fiction. And I think that there's some very interesting crossover in interests in how race is displayed through film and through science fiction and horror specifically, that we're both treading. So I'm very interested in hearing.
Nobody's here to talk and listen about me. Let me finish this by asking you this question, because we're talking about this. How does it feel to you to look at your pieces from 10 years ago now? Because for me, there's an immediacy that I feel so constantly. Just again, the pieces are about what I'm feeling as I get close to them, and being on this arc literally right now it's such a powerful feeling. I wonder what it's felt like for you, because it's moved so many places and acquired these touches, these fingerprints, these smudges, these things that have changed the weight and the texture of it.
10 years is not as difficult as like 30, right? Because some of the issues that I was doing when I first came out of grad school, some like 6X is a sculptural piece that I did with the Klan, and it's, for those of you that don't know the piece, it's basically a children's classroom hanging rack with the children's size clan suits on this schoolroom rack. And because anybody that has a kid knows there's a size called 6X. So I made these little clan suits in the 6X size, and so it hangs very low to the ground. The hats hover above the rack. Seeing that is very haunting. I made that piece in 1989, and a lot of the images and a lot of the information and a lot of the issues that went on with it, a lot of the rage as a young artist that I was trying to get out through making work, seeing that exist now, and having raised a kid myself, and she's almost off to college, and still dealing with the same issue, that's enraging. Things like that is difficult, but at the same time, you kind of look back on it and go, wow, I guess I was onto something there, coming out of the gate. And, I think that it's difficult being an artist over time, because I think you're developing a visual vocabulary. And when you first start out, you don't know if you're going to get another show. So you're going to try to do the biggest, loudest bang coming out that's going to make the most noise that people are going to, pay attention to. And, 1989, 1991, 2, 3, in that pocket was a moment where I think a lot of younger artists that had something to say politically. I
was thinking that feeling, all the racial animus is coming out of the outer boroughs of Manhattan.
Yeah.
And that I saw all that in that piece. And it also happened to be the year of Do the Right Thing. So you guys,
absolutely,
you talk about dovetailing.
And Public Enemy.
Absolutely.
You start thinking about what kind of music was being produced back then. All of that kind of filtered into
and the
it.
Bomb Squad.
Yeah, the Bomb Squad. Hank Shockley. There was a lot of different connecting points that went into that. I think that art and music and clubs and going, all of that stuff was interconnected in a lot of ways. I think now it's a little all over the place, and I think that the internet has somewhat to do with that, because I think access to certain images is more immediate. Right. Certain sounds, certain images. An artist, as soon as they finish a painting now, like immediately puts it up on Instagram. In 1990, you would have to you depended on something like the Venice Biennale to see what's going on the other side of the world. So you would fly to Venice if you were lucky enough, or you waited for Art News or Art Forum to come out with the review of the show, and then you'd see, whoa, there's a bunch of artists in Senegal that are doing interesting stuff. You didn't even know that was going on. I didn't know Maurizio Catalan, out until I saw him in a magazine. I didn't know any, Isaac Julian. Like, there's just people overseas that were
who were making art and making art with the same kind of political and social context that you were.
Yeah.
At the same time.
Yeah. And yeah, exactly. And we were on, different tracks, but we just couldn't see each other. And I think that the net actually closed some of that down, to close those gaps a little bit. Like, I can now access that, or I look at something and I see what Isaac's doing, and that access is fantastic. But it also doesn't allow for that little laboratory thing to happen. Like, if you're making work and you're immediately throwing that up on Instagram, we have a policy in the studio. There are no photographs while I'm working on a show. There's just no way. I am not loading up images, because by the time, if I load up new images on Instagram, what are you going to come to the show for? You're not going to bother to come to the show. Unless it's wall drawings, which you have to. So, I think that it's art fairs do the same thing. I think that art fairs,
but that's all about commodification.
It's about money. It's about you almost have to produce as a younger artist, you have to have two separate bodies of work on a yearly basis, right? You have your show that you're putting together in the gallery, and then you have the work that goes off to art fairs. You can't intertwine both of those together. Otherwise, you're submarining the work that you're doing in the gallery. So the work is as good. I'm not saying that it's in any way lesser, but it's not the same body of work that you're putting together for an exhibition, and you didn't have to do that before. So now you do. So you have like, this fair, you got Frieze, you got Armory, you've got Basel, you've got everything overseas. Then you have Basel and Seoul. You have you have like a art fair career body of work, and then you have like your gallery thing, and that was never there when I first came out. So younger artists, I don't know if I don't teach in art school anymore, but I hope that I've always tried to push students that I had of saying, look, this is a business. Like, we can talk about theory in here all day long. Like, I'm perfectly willing to talk to you about that, but we can also have a long conversation about how to move your work and continue going, because it's not about getting the first show. It's about getting like the 7th, 8th, 10th, 9th. Like all of those shows is important.
Takes me back to Basquiat, who suffered from that kind of overexposure.
Yeah.
He got so much exposure so
much
fast.
exposure.
And the work didn't change, but people's reaction to it did, because they were looking for the next thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because it would have been interesting to see how Basquiat his career would have developed with art fairs, right? Because hopefully he would have had somebody that would hold the work back.
The right dealer who would just say, let's just hold this,
and not just flood the market with everybody wanting this thing, and then he's gone in 5 years.
Yeah, the whole big pizza box show. Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Gary Simmons for being here.